Take a breath before we begin. If you grew up hearing stories of Burma, of monsoons, leeches, swollen rivers, and the sound of distant gunfire swallowed by jungle, this story may feel familiar. This is a tale whispered by the men who walked into green darkness and did not return the same. This is the story of the Chindits. At first, the Japanese laughed. They had carved their empire across Southeast Asia with shocking speed: Malaya, Singapore, Burma. Victories had come so easily that confidence hardened into arrogance, and their officers scoffed at any Allied attempt to resist inside the deep Burmese interior. "Western soldiers cannot survive in the jungle," they boasted. "The vines will choke them, the heat will drain them, the insects will devour them." And looking at the men the British sent, pale, underfed, worn from retreat, the Japanese believed it. They believed it fully. They did not yet know the name Chindit. They did not yet understand what those men would become. The unit took shape under a man who seemed born from another century: Orde Wingate, eccentric, brilliant, unafraid of mud, death, or bureaucracy. He believed the Japanese could be beaten in the jungle, not by outnumbering them, but by outthinking them, by moving differently, by fighting the jungle the same way it fought the men inside it, relentlessly, silently, without mercy. The early volunteers had no idea what they were stepping into. Some were from British regiments shattered during the retreat from Burma. Some were young Gurkhas with quiet resolve in their eyes. Some were seasoned veterans from Africa and India. But none of them, not one, understood the trial Wingate had in mind. Training began in India. Long marches through teak forests, river crossings where crocodiles watched from the banks, nights spent under monsoon storms so violent the sky seemed to split open. Wingate pushed them beyond endurance, telling them the jungle was not an enemy, but the judge that decided who lived and who didn't. If they learned to move through it without fear, it would swallow the Japanese instead. By early 1943, the Chindits were ready, or as ready as any men could be. Their packs were heavy with ammunition, quinine, and radio batteries. Their beards grew wild. Their uniforms rotted from the humidity. They stepped across the border into Burma without fanfare, without support, and without guarantees. Behind them, the world forgot them. Ahead of them lay 1,000 miles of silence. The Japanese mockery began immediately. Leaflets fluttered down from the sky. "Englishmen," they read, "what are you doing? The jungle is too strong for you. Return home before it consumes you." But the Chindits pushed forward through bamboo tunnels so narrow men had to walk sideways, through grass taller than a man's head, through valleys choked with vines that felt alive on the skin. They moved behind Japanese lines, not past them, not around them, but deep behind them, where no Western force was supposed to survive. And soon the Japanese stopped laughing. Sabotaged railways exploded at night. Supply depots vanished in fire. Isolated regiments awoke to find their telephone lines cut, their bridges gone, their officers missing. A whisper spread across the Burmese front: "There are ghosts in the jungle." The Japanese commander in the region wrote, "These English cannot be real. They strike and melt away. They do not fight like normal soldiers. They are demons." But the truth was far less supernatural. The Chindits were starving, fevered, exhausted, yet still moving, still biting into the Japanese rear with teeth sharpened by desperation. One officer later wrote, "The jungle did devour us, but it devoured them faster." By the time the Japanese understood the threat, entire regiments had been swallowed whole. The jungle had eaten them, with the Chindits guiding its teeth. For those who remember, this part may cut deep, because the soldiers who went into Burma rarely spoke of what they saw, only that the jungle kept its memories, and sometimes their friends. The first thing a new Chindit noticed wasn't the heat, it wasn't the insects, or the smell of wet rot, or the vines that clung to a man's clothes like hands refusing to let go. It was the silence, not the peaceful kind, not the silence of a mountain morning or a still lake. This was a silence that hovered above the jungle like a watchful animal, waiting, breathing, listening. A silence that seemed to swallow the unprepared whole. By early 1943, as the Chindits pushed deeper into Burma, the Japanese still laughed at the idea that British troops could survive for more than a week behind their lines. They mocked the long-range penetration groups as suicide columns, foreign soldiers marching into a kingdom where the jungle itself acted as the emperor's ally. They didn't understand what Wingate had built. Every man carried more than 60 pounds, rations, tools, weapons, spare socks, maps. The columns stretched like thin threads through green walls that rose 60 feet overhead. Lee Enfields slung over their backs, Brens carried low, mules trudging forward, each step sinking into mud so thick it tugged at their boots. The air buzzed with unseen life, flies, ants, mosquitoes thick as smoke beneath the canopy. By noon, shirts clung to their bodies, drenched. By dusk, the temperature crashed, and the jungle exhaled cold mist that seeped into their bones. They marched in darkness, guided only by whispers and dim compass lamps. Every day was the same: wet clothes, leeches, swollen feet, insect bites that festered, and the constant taste of quinine. Chindits joked that malaria tablets became part of a man's bloodstream, keeping the fever away just long enough to walk into the next ambush. Yet they pressed on, because somewhere ahead, miles through bamboo thickets and riverbeds, lay the targets Wingate had chosen with quiet ruthlessness. Japanese communication lines, rail depots, supply dumps, remote outposts, and villages that the enemy believed were too deep, too protected, too fortified for any Allied force to reach. They had no idea that the Chindits were already at their doorstep. At night, men slept on the ground, rifles resting across their chests. Some dreamt of home, of cold evenings in England, of family dinners left untouched by war. Others dreamt of nothing at all, too exhausted to hold a single thought. But all of them knew the same truth. In this place, the jungle chose who lived and who vanished. The Japanese patrols who mocked them had never walked weeks without resupply. They had never crossed ravines using ropes made from parachute cord, dragging mules behind them. They had never marched through elephant grass sharp enough to slice a man's skin open, or forded rivers at night with only the moon to mark their path. The Chindits didn't fight the enemy first. They fought Burma itself, and survived. What the Japanese failed to understand was that every hardship burned something into these men. A steadiness, a patience, a determination that grew with each step deeper into the Empire's shadow. The first engagements were small: a patrol spotted through the trees, a machine gun nest hidden along a ridge, shots traded through vines so thick the muzzle flashes looked like stars trapped in branches. Chindit scouts learned to read the jungle like a book: a snapped twig, a fresh footprint, the shift of birds fleeing overhead. They could feel the enemy moving long before they saw them. One of the earliest clashes came as the columns approached a Japanese outpost near Tonmakeng. Wingate's intelligence claimed the garrison was small, inattentive, unprepared. It was wrong. Japanese soldiers lay hidden along the approach trails, rifles tucked into crooks of trees, their faces painted with mud. Had the Chindits been an ordinary battalion, they would have walked into the trap and been wiped out before firing a shot. But their lead scouts halted. A faint smell on the wind, smoke from unfamiliar cigarettes, a small drift of soil on the trail disturbed too recently, and the quiet, too quiet. The Chindits moved like shadows, peeling off the column, setting up Bren guns low to the ground, positioning riflemen behind tree roots older than entire empires. The Japanese waited. The Chindits waited longer. When the enemy finally rose from concealment to spring their ambush, the jungle answered with a roar of British fire. Bren bursts cut through the bamboo in violent sweeps. Rifle shots cracked through the undergrowth, steady, disciplined, controlled. A grenade rolled down a slope, bursting in a cloud of dirt and fern. The Japanese who survived staggered backward, unable to comprehend how their trap had failed. They had mocked these long-range troops as amateurs, men too tired, too sunburned, too soaked in sweat to fight with precision. But the Chindits had learned the jungle. They struck with the patience of men who had walked miles for one chance at a clean shot. The patrol was destroyed. The outpost fell within hours, and for the first time, Japanese commanders began to whisper that maybe these British raiders were not the fragile column they had mocked, but something else. Something that learned. Something that adapted. Something that refused to die where others would have vanished. The deeper the Chindits went, the more the enemy struggled to track them. Radio messages intercepted by Allied intelligence spoke of ghost columns, units moving without pattern, and foreign troops who seem immune to exhaustion. Exaggeration? Maybe. But for the men walking through Burma, surviving on dry rations and raw courage, it felt true enough, because each day pushed them closer to the objectives Wingate had marked on his maps, and deeper into a land the Japanese believed they owned entirely. They would soon learn the jungle belonged to no one, and the men who walked inside it belonged to its silence. For those who remember, this part only becomes harder. The deeper they pushed into Burma, the more the jungle seemed to close behind them, like a door that had no intention of opening again. For the Chindits, distance wasn't measured by miles anymore. It was measured by weight. The weight of the pack on a man's shoulders, the weight of humidity in his lungs, the weight of malaria that clung to them like an invisible hand. Even the air felt hostile, heavy with rot and the scent of earth that had never been touched by sunlight. By the spring of 1943, the men had learned to move in near silence. They followed narrow trails shaped not by people, but by elephants, deer, and predators. Each step felt like trespassing. They waded through rivers that swallowed their knees, then their waists, then their chests. Lee Enfields were lifted overhead like relics, never allowed to touch the water. And every splash, every ripple, felt like a signal to the Japanese patrols waiting beyond the next tree line. Some of the Burmese scouts swore the jungle was alive, that it listened, that it warned the enemy. And sometimes the men believed it, because one moment a column would be walking beneath a canopy of green, the air still and quiet, and the next moment mortars would whistle through the branches without warning. The Japanese fired by sound, not sight. They knew something was out there, moving. They just didn't know what. Not yet. The Chindits fought not to be identified. That was their first line of survival. The Japanese knew the British used long-range penetration groups, but they didn't know where they were, how many existed, or what they truly intended. And Wingate intended to keep it that way. Their job was to appear where no one expected them, to cut supply lines, destroy outposts, and vanish into the jungle before the Japanese could react. One night in late March near the Irrawaddy, a small Chindit group halted in a clearing barely wider than a man's reach. The moonlight filtered through leaves in broken shapes. Lieutenant Maddox, thin from dysentery and carrying a fever that made his vision blur at the edges, signaled for silence. He heard something foreign beneath the natural hum of cicadas, a cadence, soft, measured. Boots, Japanese patrol, moving parallel to their position, 30 yards away, maybe less. The men lowered themselves into the mud without hesitation. They didn't breathe loudly. They didn't adjust uniforms. Maddox whispered, "Let them pass." The patrol marched for almost 2 minutes, their murmured Japanese drifting through the branches like the echo of a long-forgotten song. And then, just as suddenly, they were gone. The jungle swallowed their sound. The Chindits rose slowly, each man brushing leeches from his skin with the same emotionless repetition. Encounters like that became routine. The line between life and death was not marked by battles, but by decisions. When to move, how quickly to breathe, whether stepping on a fallen branch was worth the sound it made. These choices built the Chindits' reputation long before the Japanese ever understood what they were facing. By April, the men were worn thin. Supplies were dropped by air, small canisters drifting from Dakota aircraft, parachutes blossoming above the treetops. But sometimes the drops missed their coordinates. Sometimes the canisters burst on impact. Sometimes Japanese patrols reached them first. And on those days, the Chindits lived off the land. Rice found in abandoned villages, roots unearthed beneath banyan trees, the occasional goat from a frightened farmer who didn't understand who they were, but recognized desperation in their eyes. And through it all, Wingate drove them on. He believed pain was temporary. He believed that endurance could break an empire, not by strength, not by artillery, but by outlasting the enemy in the one environment the Japanese believed they owned. If the Chindits could prove Japan wasn't invincible in Burma, then everything else might begin to crack. The Japanese started noticing something unsettling. Outposts found abandoned, telegraph lines cut in the night, supply depots burned to ash. They began to encounter wounded survivors who spoke of attackers that emerged from the jungle in silence, struck with precision, and dissolved into the darkness. Soldiers whispered new names for them: forest spirits, bamboo phantoms, men who did not fear fever, snakes, or starvation. The truth was different. The Chindits feared all of those things. They simply didn't slow down. One morning, after marching all night to avoid detection, the column stopped near a ridge that overlooked a Japanese railway. The sun was rising, pale orange, filtered by mist. The sound of an engine rumbled faintly. Maddox, still weak but unbroken, scanned the tracks through binoculars. "Supply train," he murmured. "Coal tender, flatbeds, ammunition crates." Destruction was never random. Every explosion had purpose. Every attack fit into a larger map Wingate kept inside his mind, one that stretched far beyond Burma. The Chindits were pieces on a board, moving deep behind enemy lines to tear holes in the Japanese war machine. And that train, Maddox realized, was a tiny artery feeding a much larger heart. They positioned charges along the rails with the quiet precision of men who had done this too many times. They withdrew into foliage dense enough to swallow entire companies. Minutes passed. The rumble grew louder, and then the earth shook, not from the train, but from the explosion that ripped through its undercarriage. Smoke billowed upward, black and violent. Flames leapt from shattered carriages. The Chindits watched, but did not cheer. They simply shouldered their packs and disappeared again before the Japanese arrived to investigate. By now, rumors were spreading across Japanese command posts. Officers studied maps and asked questions with growing frustration. Who are they? How many? Their intelligence reports contradicted one another. Some claimed hundreds. Others claimed dozens. Some insisted that the British were using supernatural tricks, aided by local spirits. But all agreed on one thing: the long-range forces moving in the jungle were no longer an inconvenience. They were a threat. As April faded into May, heat thickened into something oppressive. Sweat soaked every thread of cloth. Water ran low. One Chindit, Private Thompson, wrote a single line in his diary before collapsing from dehydration. "The jungle is eating us alive." But he survived. Most did. They pushed on because the alternative was to stop. and stopping meant surrender to the jungle, or worse, capture. And yet, for all the hardship, something remarkable was happening. The Japanese were feeling pressure, real pressure, for the first time on terrain they believed belonged solely to them. Bridges were gone, railways cut, communication outposts abandoned. Small victories, perhaps, but the kind that whispered a dangerous truth. The enemy was not untouchable anymore. For the Chindits, the mission wasn't about defeating an army in open battle. It was about proving the impossible could be done, that deep penetration warfare could reach into the heart of Japanese-held territory and shake its foundation. For those who remember, this part marked the first time Japan understood the jungle no longer answered only to them. The monsoon season arrived without warning, as it always did, with a roar like distant artillery. One moment the canopy was still, heavy with the smell of damp bark and crushed foliage. The next, the sky split open, and water poured through the leaves in sheets so dense the men could hardly see their own hands. In that moment, every weapon jammed, every match went useless, and every footstep became a gamble in knee-deep mud that swallowed boots as if the earth itself were tired of the fighting. For the Chindits, this was not an interruption. It was the environment they trained to survive. The Japanese patrols believed the rains would halt the British advance. Rain destroyed maps, erased tracks, and erased the thin line between direction and disorientation. But the Chindits pressed deeper, crossing rivers swollen into churning brown tempests, moving silently through flooded valleys where even birds seemed to vanish. Their mules struggled, slipping on slick stones, their loads covered by tarps that grew heavier with each downpour. Some animals collapsed and were left behind. The officers wrote later that abandoning them felt like leaving family in the mud, because without them, the columns had no hope of carrying food or ammunition. In the heart of this weather, one of the forward patrol leaders, Captain Langford, paused by a ridge soaked in running water. He lifted his hand, and the men behind him froze instantly. Even in the storm's fury, he had heard it. Not a sound, but the absence of one. No frogs, no insects, no distant rumble of branches snapping beneath unseen feet. The jungle had inhaled, holding its breath. That meant only one thing. Someone was close. The column spread out silently, each man taking a position behind roots and rocks, the rain masking their movement. Minutes passed, long enough for nerves to tighten and muscles to ache from stillness. And then they saw shapes moving through the curtain of rain. Japanese scouts, ponchos clinging to their bodies, rifles held high to keep them dry. For a moment, neither side moved. Rain hammered leaves and helmets with the weight of gravel. Then one of the Japanese soldiers angled his head, trying to listen beyond the storm. The Chindits fired first, their rifles muffled by waterlogged air, sparks spitting from the barrels. The scouts fell to the mud without sound. Langford gestured forward. The patrol advanced before their disappearance could be reported. The deeper they went, the stranger the jungle became. Vines dropped like ropes from high branches, brushing against their faces in the darkness. Tree trunks glistened with moss, so soft it crumbled under fingertips. The smell of decay mixed with the metallic scent of ammunition. Some nights the men slept sitting upright, backs against trees, too exhausted to remove their boots, the rain dripping from the brim of their hats in a constant rhythm. Leeches slid across their arms. Mosquitoes crawled along their collars. The men learned to ignore the discomfort until it became part of their uniform. One evening, after nearly 2 weeks without seeing open sky, the leading scouts reached a clearing. Through the fog, they could make out the outline of a Japanese supply depot, a cluster of bamboo huts, fuel barrels stacked like crude monuments, and a flag whipping violently in the wind. It was larger than expected, guarded by machine gun nests camouflaged with branches. Langford knew that this was their opportunity. If the Chindits could destroy the depot, the Japanese forces in this sector would be isolated. But they had only a few minutes before the storm lightened and the risk of detection grew. He crouched with his sergeants, drawing a quick plan in the mud with a stick. The rain washed it away seconds later, but the men had already memorized each detail. They moved like shadows around the clearing, stepping through water that pooled around their boots. A mule slipped on the slope behind them, braying softly before its handler calmed it with a whisper. The sound seemed loud enough to break the world, yet the guards continued their monotony, unaware that danger crept toward them. The Chindits placed charges inside 2 fuel huts, their fuses protected by waxed wrappings. A private named Weaver described later how his hands trembled, not from fear, but from cold, as he worked the fuse beneath sheets of rain that felt like needles. The men waited in silence, positioned at the tree line, rainwater cascading from their helmets. Then Langford gave the signal. The explosion tore through the clearing with the force of a thunderclap layered atop the storm. Fire roared skyward, igniting the fuel stores in brilliant bursts that lit the forest like daylight. Japanese soldiers scrambled in panic, shouting orders drowned by the storm. Machine guns opened up blindly toward the jungle, bullets slicing through branches and sending leaves spiraling. The Chindits withdrew in disciplined silence, fading into the dripping foliage as flames consumed the depot behind them. They moved for miles afterward, barely stopping. The glow of the fire behind them smoldered on the horizon until the jungle swallowed even that. But the Japanese recovery squads were relentless. They followed footprints that filled quickly with water. They listened for snapped twigs drowned beneath the storm, and they searched with the desperation of men who understood the significance of the loss. At dawn, the Chindits crossed a ravine where the water surged in violent torrents. A rope was stretched across the span, tied to a tree on each side. One by one, the men climbed along it, gripping tightly as the river raged beneath their boots. A young soldier named Douglas slipped halfway across. For a moment, Langford saw only his hand clinging to the rope, his body suspended over the violent water. 2 men reached for him, their fingers locking around his sleeve just as it tore under the weight. They pulled him to safety. He did not speak for hours afterward, his face pale beneath the grime. As the sun climbed higher, the rain finally eased. Mist lifted from the foliage like smoke rising from an extinguished fire. The men exhaled, letting their shoulders relax for the first time in days. But the silence that followed carried its own tension. Birds slowly returned to their perches. A distant tree crashed under the weight of moisture. And somewhere behind them, Langford knew, the Japanese patrols were still searching, still angry, still embarrassed, still determined to reclaim control of the territory that the Chindits had just set ablaze. For the men resting beneath the dripping canopy, exhaustion settled over them like a blanket, but so did something else, a quiet sense of purpose. They had not come here to hold ground. They had come to disrupt, to destroy, to confuse, to fracture. And in that burning clearing, under sheets of monsoon rain, they had done just that. The jungle had consumed the evidence, but the impact lingered in every shaken patrol, every radio report, every sleepless Japanese officer trying to explain how an enemy they had mocked once again slipped through their grasp. The monsoon had passed, but the Chindits knew better than to trust the quiet. In Burma, silence was not peace. Silence was a warning. It carried the weight of unseen movements, of patrols slipping through bamboo thickets, of Japanese scouts leaving no footprint behind. By the 5th month of operations, the men no longer measured time in days or weeks. They measured it in what their bodies could still endure. One march, one clearing, one night without a corpse being carried on a stretcher made from jungle vines. For the newer units arriving as reinforcements, the sight of the veterans was sobering. These were not the men who had left India months earlier. Their uniforms hung from them like draped cloth. Their faces were gaunt, carved by hunger and fever. Their eyes, the part that unsettled the newcomers most, had the distant focus of people who lived too long with death hovering beside them. But when they spoke, when they shared instructions or cautions, their voices were steady, and that steadiness became a kind of anchor for everyone around them. Word filtered through the units that the Japanese were massing again, not in the clumsy rushes of earlier months, but methodically, tightening around the Chindit strongholds. It was the kind of pressurizing tactic the Japanese excelled at, pushing with small probing units, testing for weaknesses, mapping any point where the British perimeter thinned. The Chindits sensed it long before Norahugi's intelligence runners reported it. The jungle told them first. Fewer birds, fewer sounds. Even the wind felt wary. But Lentane insisted they hold. Merrill's marauders farther north were relying on them to pin Japanese forces and disrupt lines of communication. The Chindits were no longer raiders slipping behind enemy lines. They were the hinge that kept the northern front from collapsing. And though many of the men were too exhausted to care about strategic maps, they understood one truth clearly. If they fell back now, the consequences would ripple across Burma. In mid-June, the Japanese launched their push. It began at dawn, not with gunfire, not with mortars, but with silence. A silence so complete it made seasoned soldiers uneasy. Then the crack of a single rifle, then another. Men ducked into firing pits, gripping Bren guns slick with humidity. Seconds later came the sound they dreaded most, the shrill rising yell of a Japanese charge cutting through the trees. The Chindits responded with the grim efficiency of men who had been here before. Fire discipline held, bursts measured, ammunition counted mentally with each squeeze of the trigger. The first wave broke, bodies disappearing into the tangled growth. The second wave followed, closer, faster, relentless. Some of the newer men faltered, shaking hands and uneven breaths. A veteran from the Black Watch steadied one by gripping his shoulder and saying quietly, "Breathe. Aim for shapes, not faces." The younger soldier nodded, swallowed, and steadied his rifle. By noon, the fighting shifted east, then west, the Japanese searching for a crack. By evening, the Chindits still held, but their trenches were full of mud, spent cartridges, and men too tired to speak. The medical tents overflowed. Fever did not pause for battles. One doctor, his hands trembling from lack of food, tied makeshift splints with strips torn from his own shirt. The groans of the wounded blended with the hum of mosquitoes, the smell of antiseptic mixed with the smell of rot. Yet that night, something remarkable happened. A supply drop, the first in days, descended through a temporary break in the clouds. Parachutes bloomed in the darkness like pale flowers drifting down. The men looked up, barely believing it. Food, ammunition, quinine, radio batteries, even a few tins of condensed milk that someone at headquarters must have slipped in as an act of mercy. When the crates thudded into the mud, some of the hardest men in the brigade knelt beside them and closed their eyes. Gratitude wasn't a word they used, but feeling it didn't require speech. 2 days later, the Japanese shifted to night attacks. The Chindits dreaded these more than anything. The jungle at night was a different world, disorienting, suffocating, alive with dangers that daylight hid. Visibility vanished, shadows merged. Every rustle felt like footsteps. Every snap of a branch felt like a blade brushing past. On the third night, a patrol failed to return. At dawn, the search team found only a burnt clearing and a single boot. The message was clear. The Japanese were close, and they were patient. But even patience had limits. The Chindits, though starved and sick, understood the enemy's patterns. They anticipated the next push before it came. At dusk, they repositioned Bren teams along the northern approach and placed the Gurkhas, silent, deadly, steady-handed, in the ravines flanking the main perimeter. When the Japanese attack came hours later, it collided with this reformed line like a wave breaking against stone. The Gurkhas held their ground, moving with practiced silence. The Bren gunners maintained disciplined arcs. The Japanese momentum faltered, then broke. When the moon rose higher, the jungle floor was littered with abandoned packs and rifles. Still, the Chindits didn't celebrate. They didn't cheer. They conserved their voices, their breath, their strength. The victory was temporary. They knew dawn would bring another test. The next morning, a courier reached them with a message from Stilwell's command. The words were simple. "Hold. Reinforcements are moving." The men exchanged tired glances. Reinforcements, whether days away or weeks, meant hope. Not victory, but the possibility of surviving long enough to see something beyond mud and bamboo. Somewhere near the command tent, a veteran from the earlier Wingate expeditions leaned against a tree trunk and whispered half to himself, "The jungle doesn't hate us. It just doesn't care whether we go home." Those words spread quietly through the unit, repeated by exhausted soldiers as though acknowledging a truth they'd lived for months. The jungle wasn't an enemy. It was simply a force, indifferent, consuming, eternal, and surviving it required something more than ammunition or rations. It required endurance of the soul. By the final months of 1944, the Chindits had become something strange in the eyes of the world. Not a regiment, not a brigade, not even an elite force in the traditional sense. They were closer to a rumor, a shadow, a warning whispered through jungles no map had ever truly captured. And yet, they were nearly gone. Their bodies told the story first. The weight they'd lost, the fever that clung to them, the 1,000-yard stare of men who had walked through a world that no one else could imagine. When they marched out of the jungle after their final operation, one British reporter wrote that they looked half ghost, half soldier. And he wasn't wrong. The war in Burma was shifting. The monsoon had returned. Roads became rivers. Rivers became traps. The Japanese still fought with relentless fury, and Allied commanders knew they were approaching the last bloody stages of the Burmese campaign. But the Chindits, what remained of them, were finished. Not because they lacked courage, not because they broke, but because they had given everything a human being could give. Their final extraction was quiet. No music, no cheers, no triumphant march. Just a long, staggered line of men crossing a makeshift airstrip cut into the mud, climbing into planes that would take them back to India, back to hospitals, back to sleep, back to something that might resemble life. A flight nurse later wrote, "We didn't recognize them at first. They moved like men twice their age, but their eyes were fierce. Some couldn't stand without help. Some collapsed in the fuselage before the plane even lifted off. Others stared blankly out the small round window, watching the jungle fall away beneath them. The same jungle that had swallowed friends, commanders, entire units. The same jungle that had nearly taken them too. On the ground below, the monsoon erased their footprints one by one. By the time the last Chindit plane banked north, the jungle had already begun its quiet work, absorbing the paths they carved, the camps they built, the airstrips they hacked from nothing. Within days, vines crept up the trunks where they had tied their mules. Within months, entire clearings vanished beneath ferns and new growth. The jungle remembered them, but it never preserved their trail. In India, medical officers examined them with a kind of stunned respect. The numbers were staggering: malaria, dysentery, scrub typhus, beriberi, wounds infected beyond recognition. Some men weighed barely 100 pounds. One doctor showed Wingate's staff a Chindits boots, the soles completely worn through. He whispered, "He marched like this for miles." But the men didn't complain, not once. Not even in the hospital wards where the sheets were clean and the air smelled of antiseptic instead of rot. They simply lay there, quietly, solemnly, as if unsure whether rest was something they were allowed to feel. Officers visited them, nurses comforted them, commanders saluted them, but the Chindits themselves were subdued, not broken, just distant, as if part of them was still out there beneath the canopies, moving silently through the undergrowth, listening for the rustle of bamboo, waiting for orders that would never come again. Some would recover, some never fully did. Years later, one veteran admitted in an interview, "I woke up for decades thinking I still heard rain on leaves. Not rain on a roof, leaves." Another said that for the rest of his life, he couldn't walk through a park without scanning the trees for movement. War leaves marks that medals never cover, and the Chindits were covered in them. As the Allied armies pushed deeper into Burma, other units took the lead: armored columns, Indian divisions, African brigades, American Merrill's marauders. The Chindits had cleared the path, broken the lines, disrupted the rear, shattered communications, and done the impossible in the most unforgiving terrain in Asia. Their legacy lived on through every advance that followed. But the Chindits themselves faded from the front pages as the war's center of gravity shifted toward Europe and the Pacific. Burma was always the forgotten front, and the men who fought there, the ones who walked through storms, marched on blistered feet, starved, endured, survived, they became in many ways forgotten too, but not by everyone. Years later, a British historian visiting the overgrown remains of a Chindit airstrip found a rusting fragment of corrugated metal half buried in vines. On it, carved roughly with a knife, were 3 words: "Still holding on." No one knows which Chindit scratched it there, or when, or why. But it doesn't take much imagination to understand the message, because that's who they were. Men who held on long after anyone else would have let go. Men who defied an entire theater of war. Men who turned the impossible into routine. Men who fought not for glory, but because someone had to do what no one else could. When the war finally ended and the veterans returned home to small towns in England, villages in Scotland, farms in Wales, they rarely spoke of what they'd done. When they did, their voices were quiet, measured, never boastful, never seeking recognition. One Chindit, when asked what he remembered most, said only, "The silence after the fighting stopped. Not peace, just silence." And he looked away, as if that silence belonged to the jungle, not to him. Today, little remains of their battlefields. Nature has reclaimed almost everything. The places where they fought are green and calm. Birdsong fills the canopy where once only the hum of mosquitoes and the crack of distant rifles echoed. But their memory endures, not in monuments, though some exist, not in movies, though few have told their story truthfully. Their memory endures in the quiet reverence of those who know the truth. The Chindits didn't win their battles through firepower or numbers. They won them through endurance, through suffering, through a kind of relentless determination that no jungle, no monsoon, no fever, no enemy ambush could break. And that is why they were feared. That is why the Japanese stopped mocking them. That is why commanders across the theater spoke their name with respect. Because the Chindits did not simply fight the jungle, they outlasted it. And when their story is told, when their footsteps echo once more through memory, it becomes clear why the enemy never understood them until it was far too late. For those who remember, the jungle never truly released them. It merely let them go home.